So, what exactly do you mean when you say, what do you mean?
I do not understand this. This really confuses me.
What's that supposed to mean?
Literally.
What's that supposed to mean?
What's that supposed to mean?
I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about?
What's that supposed to mean?
Cultural anthropologist Ujwal Arkalgud and Motive Base president Jason Partridge will tell you that perception and meaning are the primary pressure points that shape and create the world we live in.
Inconceivable! You keep using that word.
Let's explore why meaning matters.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
Now, here's your host, Aaron Trafford.
Well, here we are, episode 10 of season 2, and it's actually hard to believe. I don't know where the time has gone. Welcome into Why Meaning Matters, and this season has been super fun, I think, personally, because we have selected some key topics and niche areas and just started to go really deep on those and pick them apart piece by piece. And in the last episode, we started to talk about cannabis and weed, and how the meanings around that from a health and wellness perspective have started to shift quite rapidly. But there was a lot, guys, that we left unsaid around these bigger notions of culture. Because here's what I know, or you tell me if I actually know this from a cultural perspective, that despite legalization and decriminalization in majority of countries around the world now, Western nations, there's still this huge underground economy for weed and cannabis. And I want to know exactly what you think about the meaning of smoking weed and how that level is starting to shift, how our meanings around that have shifted sort of beyond that whole health and wellness level.
Absolutely. And Aaron, I wanted to go back to, this is also a test for the listener. If you haven't heard season 1, go back and revisit it, because we talked about this notion of how ideas start as myths in culture, and then eventually they become truths. And something becomes a truth when enough people agree on that myth, when enough people build consensus on that myth. So what I wanted to bring up is a myth around cannabis, and that myth that is developing, so it's in early consensus stages, is the impact that cannabis culture is going to have on human productivity. So instead of talking about, what the culture is like of smoking weed or buying underground weed or whatever else that is, I think what's more interesting is the implication this is having now on employers, employees, on our general perception of our sense of, work-life balance and how productive we can be as a society. I think there's something very interesting there, because the myths around it are especially exacerbated by the fact that now we're going into a culture where we're saying it's okay to work from home. A lot of companies will leave that as optional now. More and more employees will be working from home. So literally the fear is, I'm dealing with a colleague of mine. Are they high all day long? Right? Is that impacting their work? How do I know if I'm getting the real person on the other end? I mean, it sounds a little embellished to say that, but these are some real concerns that are emerging. And I think if you're a cannabis company, or you work in a cannabis company, or you're listening to this is a huge threat that you're going to have to deal with, right? Because as a cannabis company, you're not just selling cannabis, you're not just legitimizing the products or talking about the science behind it. You also have to tackle some of these myths early enough in their life cycle. Otherwise, you're screwed in a way, right? Because you want your industry to get elevated like the way alcohol got elevated.
Well, and if any category or any product should be aware of, the role of embellishment in creating false myths around it, it should be cannabis. I mean, here's a situation where we came out of the notion of reefer madness back in the day. The interesting thing here is it's instead of, kind of the, jumping out the window or, forgetting that the baby's in the house and the house being set on fire, now it's this idea of killing productivity, which, while at the same time is a little bit less dramatic potentially of some of the embellishments that happened in the past, but in some ways it's more dangerous, because what is really interesting is that the more a myth is easy to understand and the more a myth is easy to identify as something you can relate to, the more sticky it can be. So, I think it's really fascinating that Ujwal's bringing up this point that, as people are going through one kind of transition, which is trying to find a new way to engage with coworkers, a new way to connect with coworkers and collaborate with coworkers, that in and of itself is giving birth to new tensions and some that are impacting different categories, one being cannabis.
So my brain is on fire right now. I have so many questions. Okay, so here's what I'm hearing you say is that we have come through decades of cultural belief or myth that smoking weed is something that needs to be hidden and can't be talked about publicly because there's some shame around it or some sort of illegality or it's not a highbrow thing to do, right? But then also that it has been culturally associated through cinema, culture, movies, pop culture with being incapable of producing things. And as you're saying this, I'm thinking about, wow, what an interesting sort of dialogue or tension between some of those other, what we could call street level drugs now, even though they're prescription, like the Adderalls that we perceive do the opposite.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. Like you think about the culture of Silicon Valley and all of these guys, they're, popping Adderall so that they can work 24 hours a day. How do we balance that with the everybody smoking weed now because we can?
Yeah, and related to that is this whole movement around wellness and getting down to earth. I don't mean that in terms of our personalities, but in terms of getting back to nature, so to speak, right? So, and the problem in culture is that there are a lot of really well-known spokespeople that represent this, but then they also represent really iffy circumstances, right? And one person that comes to mind is James Franco, the actor, right? I forget, what was the award show he hosted, Jay, where he was...
the Oscars.
The Oscars. Yeah, everybody said he was high in the Oscars with Anne Hathaway. Yeah. And it would have been one thing if the performance was good, but everybody raked him and Anne over the coals because it was a very awkward performance of hosting. And then, of course, later you discover all these other things about James Franco in terms of, the way he treats women and all this other stuff. So now you've got one set of meanings associated with, smoking weed, using cannabis. And then on the other hand, you've got in recent times, the Seth Rogans of the world who are, advocating for, like, Seth Rogen makes pottery with his hands and, smokes weed all the time and is living the wellness life. And of course, he's anti-vax. So, again, this is a whole other issue now that's happening where now you've disconnected science from cannabis in culture. So if you're a cannabis company, you have got to be freaking out right now because on one hand, everybody started to throw money at cannabis and it's not yielding the way it was supposed to yield. And on the other hand, I have not seen a single example of a cannabis company, a cannabis brand that has found a way to build a proper, legitimate brand out of this. It's a mess.
Ujwal, I mean, like, think about the Marlboro Man was an icon that was built in order to legitimize what smoking meant, right? The history that is attached to Scotch in regards to what Glenlivet means, and what Johnny Walker means. All of these things are built around these notions of sophistication or masculinity or getting the job done. Like, if you think about, the idea of, like, what did smoking represent, 20 years ago in advertising agencies? It was, when I can't break through with a great idea, we go outside and have a cigarette and we talk about it. And that's the moment where we have this big epiphany. There's all these little subcultures that have been built around the role of alcohol and smoking as facilitating kind of productivity, while at the same time, cannabis is being linked to this notion of laziness, right? Even, the hardest working comedians, if you go back to, kind of comedians that have built their career around the idea of basically kind of being stoned, people like Doug Benson, people like Dave Chappelle back in the day, they were so hardworking as comedians. They were touring. They were working every single night. They were, like, incredibly diligent in their craft, but even the kind of the mythos that they built around themselves was that they were typical stoner, right? And so this is the legacy that cannabis has to overcome. This is the kind of the thinking that they need to be doing, not just in regards to branding, but in regards to like, what are the occasions that really are shaping the right time to be indulging, right? Again, alcohol has the aperitif. It's sophisticated, right? Like, what is cannabis's aperitif?
This is fascinating to me because I think we finally got to this point where everything you have been saying to me over the last 2 seasons just landed for me completely. This is like the exact example that I needed to hear you say, because everything comes down to with this cannabis thing is that the myth is the brand. And now whoever is the one to break that and kind of ride the next wave is going to be the one that's going to win it, right? The myth is so strong that the cannabis companies are either rising or failing based on how attached or detached they are from that meaning.
Yep. And let's bring it all the way back, Aaron, to what you referenced at the beginning of the show, right? Which is, why is there a group of consumers that don't believe in what quote unquote big cannabis is doing? Why are they holding back and staying with underground sources when there are legitimate kind of quote unquote legitimate ways of basically accessing cannabis now? It's because they have built legitimacy in their culture. They have built legitimacy in their circles of understanding where and what and when the occasion is, as well as what the product is that they want. And they trust their experience because they were on their own for so long. So again, if cannabis wants to make inroads with those groups of consumers, they also have to figure out what authenticity means with those consumers. Otherwise, they're going to constantly be at odds with each other.
Oh, that's like a 4-letter word, authenticity. For big corporations, I think that's a frightening term.
It's a frightening
100%.
term, and the problem is that it means different things in different contexts, and people don't realize that, right? And I think for the longest time, authenticity has been brought back to this idea that, oh, just be true to yourself and true to who you are and all that stuff. That's not what authenticity is to the consumer, to the end user. And you have to figure out what authenticity is in the context of cannabis. And here's, let's add another layer of complexity. The definition of authenticity is different in the context of cannabis for recreation, and it's different in the context of cannabis for medical purposes, let's say for pain relief and all that other stuff. So there's a lot of complexity and layers to this. But again, to Jason's earlier point, the sky is wide open. We're waiting. Yes. Who's going to take the big leap?
Who's going to break through?
Yeah, exactly. That's the big one.
Yeah, I'm reading that book right now, by the way, The Big Leap. I don't know if you've read that one. It's a good one in terms of breaking your own understanding of myth. So I'll send you guys the link and we can reference that in this episode. And what this actually ties into what I want to talk about next, because I think what we're dancing around is the being daring enough to be creative and to push that creative envelope. And right now, I think we're also in a bit of a creative revolution vis-a-vis the pandemic, branding and authenticity. So that's something I want to dive into in the next episode if you guys are cool with that.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Why Meaning Matters. Thanks so much for listening. If you would like to send us a comment, drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com and make sure that you subscribe, like, and share this show with all of your friends and colleagues. Leave us a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts. That really goes a long way to helping other people find the show. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Why Meaning Matters with Ujwal Arkulgud, Jason Partridge, and your host, Aaron Trafford.
Inconceivable! You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Why Meaning Matters is produced for Motive Base and the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.